In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. I understood he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon, for the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and as I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt like I wanted the world to be in uniform and had a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represents everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some higher sensitivity to the promises of life, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that registers earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I've never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family have been prominent well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line is my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51 and a substitute to the Civil War and started the wholesale hardware business my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now felt like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east, permanently I thought, in the spring of '22. The practical thing was to find rooms in this city, but it was a warm season and I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington and I went up to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days, until he ran away, and an old Dodge, and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast, and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" she asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees just as things grow in fast movies, I felt that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. And it was so much fine health to be pulled down to the young, breath-giving air. About a dozen volumes on banking and credits and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at through a single window after all. It is a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It is on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end. But their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual wonder to the gulls flying overhead. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house is at the very tip of the egg, 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard, a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivory, and a marble swimming pool, and over 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore and had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war, I'd spent a few days with them in Chicago. Why they came east, I don't know. I'd spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then traveled here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe her. Oh, fuck, I missed a bunch of shit. The history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I know Tom got us. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends to ever play football in New Haven. A national figure in a way. One of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach, but now they'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe her. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened on a warm, windy evening. I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Fucked up somewhere. Two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The front lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the sides in bright vines, as if from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the porch. Standing on the porch with his legs apart? Fuck. He had changed since his New Haven years. He was now a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes couldn't hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and one could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage. A cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness that he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked, and there had been men at New Haven who had hated his guts. And I don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a minute on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again politely and abruptly. "We'll go inside." We walked through a high hallway into a bright rose-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little ways into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out at the other, twisting them up like pale flags towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippling over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. Both were in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they'd just been blown back in from after a short flight around the house. I must have stood there for a moment, listening to... I must have stood there for a moment, listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan closed the rear window, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rug and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She sat at her end of the divan, extended full length, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she showed no sign. She gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology by having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed. An absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came a little forward into the room. "I'm paralyzed with happiness." She laughed again as if she'd said something very witty. Then she smiled and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was the way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her. An irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered, and she nodded at me almost imperceptibly. Again, a sort of apology rose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began asking me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "The whole town's desolate. All the cars have their left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." Then she added irrelevantly, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to." "She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's..." Tom Buchanan, who'd been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested a hand on my shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bond man." "With who?" I told him. "Never heard of them," he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. "You will," I said quickly. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East." he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if alert to something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said absolutely with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been sitting on that sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't blame me," retorted Daisy. "I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon." "No, thank you," said Miss Baker to the tray of 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked at her incredulously. "You are. How you get anything done is beyond me." "You are." He took down his drink as if it were the drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at Miss Baker. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulder like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. I realized then that I'd seen her or a picture of her somewhere before. "You live at West Egg," she said contemptuously. "I know somebody there." "I don't know a single—" "You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could answer, he was my neighbor. Dinner was announced. Wedging a tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room, as if moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly at their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out onto the rosy-colored porch, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" It's backwards. She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it." "We have to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What'll we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she said. "I hurt it." We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "I know you didn't mean to do it, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big hulking specimen of a—" "I hate that word hulking," insisted Tom crossly. Even in jest. "Hulking," insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker spoke at once, with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter. That was as cool as their impersonal eyes, and as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desires. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over and casually put away. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and that later, the evening too would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close, in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I said, I confessed, after my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. "Can't you talk about crops or something?" I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in a strange way. "Civilization's going to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about everything. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empire by this man Goddard?" "Why, no," I answered, rather surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow's worked the whole thing out. Or is it worked out the whole thing? It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously into the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod. She winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency were no longer as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was no longer enough for him. When the telephone rang inside and the butler left the table, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned forward to me excitedly. "I'd love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose. Doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose?" This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart were trying to come out to you in one of those breathless, thrilling words. "I'll tell you a family secret," she said. No. Damn it. Concealing one of those breathless, thrilling words. I got things all shifted around. When the butler came back to the table, murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, threw down his napkin, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her. Oh, shit, I did have it backwards. And the telephone rings inside. Daisy seizes upon the momentary interruption and leaned forward to me excitedly. "I'll tell you a family secret. It's about the butler's nose. Would you like to hear it? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for a group of people in New York who had a silver service for over 200 people. And he had to polish from morning till night until it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse," suggested Miss Baker. "Yes," confirmed Daisy. "Things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position." For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her face. Her voice drew me breathlessly forward as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her face with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. When the butler came back, murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward excitedly. "I'd love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose." "Doesn't he? An absolute rose?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose?" "This is untrue. I'm not even faintly like a rose." She was only extemporizing, but the stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart were trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw down her napkin, excused herself, and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a glance consciously devoid of meaning. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed. Leaned forward, trying to hear, unashamed. I was about to speak when she sat up and said, "Shh," in a warning tone. "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor," I began. "Don't talk," she said. "I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. "You mean to say you don't know? I thought everybody knew." "I don't." "Why," she began hesitantly, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman," I repeated blankly. She nodded. "You'd think she'd have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you?" Or just, you'd think she'd have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, wouldn't you? Almost before I grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a white dress and the crunch of a leather boot, and Daisy and Tom were back at the table. "Couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and then continued, "I looked outside for a minute. It's very romantic. I looked outdoors for a minute. It's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over in the canard of the White Star Line. And he's singing away." Her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then to me, then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner, I'll take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside again, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't have guessed what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I wonder if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, it might have been intriguing. My instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While, trying to seem pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a series of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and gradually her eyes moved out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true." She hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time of things, Nick. I've gotten to be terribly pessimistic about everything." Evidently she had reason to be. I waited for her to continue for a minute. She didn't, and I waited for her to continue, but she didn't, and after a minute I returned rather feebly to the subject of her little girl. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh yes," she looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick. Let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much," I said. "It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where, and I came out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. I turned to the nurse right away and asked if it was a boy or a girl. She said it was a girl, and I turned my head away and wept. "All right," I said, "I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." "You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, all the best people. And I know so. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything." Her eyes flashed about defiantly, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. The moment her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. I waited for a moment. I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said, as if the whole evening had been a trick of some kind to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited for a minute, and sure enough, she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had just asserted her membership into a secret society to which, a distinguished secret society to which only she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words running together in a soothing tone, murmurous and uninflected. The light, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned the page with a flutter of the slender muscles in her arm. She held us silent for a moment. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment, with a raised hand. "To be continued," she said, throwing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee. 10 o'clock, she said. "Time for this good girl to go to bed." Jordan's playing in the tournament tomorrow," said Daisy helpfully. "Oh, you're Jordan Baker." I knew now why her face had been familiar. Its rotogravure picture. Its unimpressed expression had looked out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Palm Beach and Hot Springs. I'd read some story of her too. An unpleasant, judgmental story, but what it was I'd forgotten long ago. Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up, I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, said Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of, fling you together. Oh, lock you up in broom closets and push you out to sea in a boat, that sort of thing. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. We sat in silence for a moment. Daisy and Tom looked at each other in silence for a moment. Nice girl, said Tom. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't to? Inquired Daisy coldly. Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to take care of her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to be spending a lot of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I inquired quickly. Louisville. Our girlhood was spent there together, our beautiful white... Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? Said Daisy. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes. It just... One thing led to another, and it seemed to just creep up on us. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick. I assured him that I hadn't heard anything, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They followed me to the door and stood in a cheery patch of light, a cheery square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, "Wait. We forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west." Yes, Tom confirmed kindly. We heard you were engaged. It's a libel, I'm too poor. But we heard it, said Daisy, surprising me by opening up in a flower-like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Of course I knew what they were referring to. The fact that gossip had published the bounce was one of the reasons that I had come east. You can't stop going with an old friend just because of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Nevertheless, their interest rather touched me and made them seem less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I had an uneasy feeling. I felt uneasy and rather disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to flee the house immediately, child in arms. But there was no such intention in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman was rather less surprising than the fact that he had been depressed by a book. Something was causing him to nibble at the edges of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism were no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep into summer on roadhouse roofs and at wayside gas stations where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. When I drove back to my estate at West Egg, and rolled the car under its shed and sat out on an abandoned lawn roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and the full bellows of the earth blowing the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered in the moonlight in my peripheral vision, and turning to watch it, I noticed I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion, with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn told me that it was Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would be enough of an introduction, but I did not call to him, for he gave the sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He thrust his hands out seaward, and, far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was shaking. Involuntarily, I glanced towards the dark water and discerned nothing, except a green light, minute and far away, that could have been the end of a dock. Looking back, I noticed that Gatsby was gone. When I looked for Gatsby once more, he was gone, leaving me alone in the unquiet night. Chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills, and grotesque gardens where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track that's at a ghastly creak and comes to rest, and immediately ash-gray men with leaden spades swarm up and stir up an impenetrable dust which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a minute, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist had set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot about them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days of sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he strolled into popular cafes with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. I had no desire to, though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I was taking the train up to New York. I was taking the train with Tom up to New York. When we stopped by the ash heaps, he leapt to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." The supercilious, before that, literally forced me from the car. The supercilious assumption was that on a Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road 100 yards or so under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small square of yellow brick, a sort of compact main street on the edge of the wasteland, ministering to it, and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes, and the third was a garage. Repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold. And I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford that crouched in a dim corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself emerged from the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. A damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue... When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old boy," said Tom jovially, slapping him on the shoulder. "How's business?" I can't complain, said Wilson unconvincingly. When are you going to sell me that car? Next week, said Tom. I've got my man working on it now. Works pretty slow, don't he? No, he doesn't, said Tom. If you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all. I didn't mean it like that, said Wilson. I didn't mean it like that, said Wilson. It's just that his voice trailed off. Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman blocked the light from the office door. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face contained no facet or gleam of glamour. No gleam or facet of glamour or beauty. But there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly and, walking through her husband as though he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. Get some chairs, why don't you, so someone can sit down. Oh, right, said Wilson, and hurried off towards the office door, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls, or mixing immediately with, the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his gray suit, as it veiled everything in the area, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. I want to see you, he said. Get on the next train. We'll meet you by the newsstand. She nodded and moved away just as Wilson emerged from the office with 2 chairs. We waited down the road and out of sight, watching a scrawny gray Italian child sitting. It was near the 4th of July. We waited down the road and out of sight. We watched. It was near the 4th of July, and we watched a scrawny gray Italian child setting torpedoes along the railroad track. Terrible place, isn't it? Terrible place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown. Awful place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. Awful, I said. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband mind? Wilson? He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. He thinks that she goes to see her sister in New York. So, Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I went on the train together to New York. We're not quite together. Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers who might have been on the train. She had changed her dress. I missed the reference to her first dress. She had changed her dress into a brown figured muslin which clung tightly to her hips as she stepped down from the train in New York. As Tom helped her down from the train in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and some moving picture magazines. And at the drugstore, she bought some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. In the driveway, she let 4 taxicabs go before selecting a new one. Lavender in color with a gray interior, or gray upholstery. Or gray in color with lavender upholstery. And in this, we moved from the throng of the station out into the gray, or out into the sunny afternoon. Then she turned sharply from the glass. She turned sharply from the window, knocked on the glass, and said, "Wait. I want to get one of those dogs. They're a nice thing to have, a dog." So we backed up to an old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller, and slung from his neck was a basket of very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. How much are they? Or what kind are they? Asked Miss Wilson enthusiastically as he approached the taxicab window. "All kinds, lady," he said. "What kind do you want?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs," she said earnestly. I don't suppose you got that kind." He peered doubtfully into the basket, plunged in a hand, and came up with something by the back of his neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "Well, it's not a police dog exactly," said the man. "It's more of an Airedale." "But look at that coat. That's a dog. That's some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold." "I think it's cute," said Miss Wilson. Somethingly. "How much is it?" That dog? It's $10. The Airedale? Surely there was some Airedale mixed up in there somewhere, though its paws were shockingly white. Changed hands and settled down into Miss Wilson's lap, where she caressed its weatherproof coat. "Here's your money," said Tom. "Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." We drove over the park. We drove over the park past 158th Street. It was a warm and pastoral day. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. "I've got to leave you here," I said. "No, you don't," insisted Tom quickly. "Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you leave. Won't you, Myrtle?" And then Myrtle says, "I'll telephone my sister. She's said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know." We went back along the park towards 158th Street and stopped at one slice in a white cake of townhouses. Miss Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and threw a homecoming glance around the neighborhood and went inside. In the elevator, she said, "I'll telephone the McKees from the flat below to come up. And of course I've got to call my sister." A reluctant elevator boy was dispatched for a saucer of milk and a basket of hay, to which on his own initiative he added a tin of hard dog biscuits, one of which sat apathetically decomposing in the saucer all afternoon. The apartment was much too small. A living room, a dining room, a bedroom, and a bathroom, and a set of furniture much too large for it. And it's decorated with pictures of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. And Miss Wilson changes her dress, her costume again, and with it comes a change in her personality to an impressive hauteur. As she expanded, the room grew smaller until she was pivoting on a smoky axis. At some point, Tom gets a bottle of whiskey out of the cabinet, and we get to... I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, though the apartment was full of cheerful sun until 8 o'clock. First, there were no cigarettes, so I went out to the corner drugstore to get some. And when I came back, Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink, we called each other by our first names, had disappeared. So I sat discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either the whiskey had gotten to me, or it was terrible stuff, because it made no sense to me. When Tom and Miss Wilson reappeared, company commenced arriving at the apartment door. The McKees came up from the floor below. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid bob of sticky red hair, a solid bob of sticky red hair, and a complexion powdered milky white. The eyebrows had been removed and drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but nature's efforts towards the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking as innumerable pottery bracelets jangled up and down her arm. She came in and looked at the furniture with such proprietary haste that I wondered if she lived there. But when I asked, she laughed out loud. No, she laughed immodestly, repeated the question aloud, and said that she lived in a hotel with a girlfriend. In an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, and there was a spot of white lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greetings to everyone in the room. He was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer, and he had taken the photo, the enlarged photo of Mrs. Wilson's mother that hung on the wall and gazed down into the room like an ectoplasm. And this is where Miss Wilson had changed her dress again. And with the change in costume had come a change in her personality. And at some point, Mrs. McKee says, "I love you in that dress." And Mrs. Wilson says, Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment with a raised eyebrow. "This old thing," she said, "it's just something that I throw on when I don't care what I look like." That's all I